I drove for 4 straight hours across California's Central Valley, wanting nothing more than to walk my daughter down the aisle and hand her over to the man she loved at her engagement dinner. But when I finally reached the wrought iron gates of that private winery, there was no welcome crew waiting for me. Instead, I was met by a heavily armed private security guard holding a tablet. On the screen was a photo of my face, with a thick red X drawn across it. Below my picture, a few words permanently ended my role as a father. Access denied. Brand risk. I didn't scream and I didn't beg. I just calmly turned my old pickup truck around and made a single phone call. 3 hours later, the lights went out, the champagne was cleared away, and my daughter finally realized that her perfect day had completely ended the exact moment she decided I wasn't worthy of being a part of it. Before I tell you how I turned her biggest moment into a lesson she will never forget, you should know that my name is Arthur Vance. The folks around town just call me Old Arthur. At 62 years old, my hands feel like rusty sandpaper, and the wrinkles on my face look like a map of every heavy machinery salvage yard I've ever managed. To the outside world, I'm just an old guy driving a 2004 Chevy Silverado that creaks anytime I push it past 60 miles an hour. But to my daughter, Chloe, I was an embarrassment. I was a smudge of mud on the pristine Silicon Valley socialite image she had so carefully manufactured for herself. It was a Saturday evening in October, and the Napa Valley air carried the faint, sweet scent of ripening grapes. The sky was turning a deep shade of purple and blue. I was wearing my only suit, something I bought from Macy's 10 years ago, which had been gently swaying under a plastic cover in the back seat of my truck for the entire drive. I spent all morning using WD-40 and black shoe polish to shine my work boots, because I never could stand those tight, patent leather dress shoes. My destination was the Oaks and Stones private winery. It is one of the most exclusive hidden venues on the West Coast, where the lawns are manicured using laser levels, and the water in the fountain smells lightly of lavender. Just booking the place for a single night costs a flat fee of $250,000. Chloe had told me that this engagement dinner and investment mixer was fully funded by her fiancé, Julian. She described Julian as a rising tech mogul, a visionary venture capitalist, and a man who could move Wall Street using nothing but his brain. She said his family came from old Boston wealth, establishing a deep and prestigious legacy. She was lying. I pulled off the Pacific Coast Highway and turned into the private driveway, which was lined with tall cypress trees. My old pickup gave a low, heavy rumble, sounding like an ancient dinosaur intruding into a world meant only for Teslas and Porsches. Up ahead, I could see the valet station where a few young men in crisp, tailored vests were standing, their hands looking like they had never touched a drop of motor oil in their lives. A surge of pride welled up in my chest. It wasn't because of the luxury surrounding me, but because my little girl was getting married. Even though we had drifted apart over the last few years, with the distance between San Francisco and the Central Valley growing wider, and despite the rare missed calls and brief holiday texts, I was still her father. Tucked inside the inner pocket of my jacket was a cashier's check for $100,000. It was my engagement gift to her, meant to serve as a down payment for her future home in Palo Alto. I stopped my truck right before the security checkpoint. This wasn't just a simple guard shack, it was a fortress, built from polished limestone and bulletproof glass. A large guard wearing a tactical headset and dark sunglasses stepped out. He didn't bother looking at me. Instead, he stared down at my truck, eyeing the rust on the fenders and checking to see if I was dripping any oil onto their flawless asphalt. He held up a single hand, palm flat, stopping me in my tracks before I could even roll down the window. I forced the window down anyway. The air conditioning in my truck had broken 3 years ago, and I was already starting to sweat. The guard gave a cold demand for my name. It wasn't a polite question, it felt like an interrogation. I smiled and told him my name is Arthur Vance, adding that I am the father of the bride-to-be. The guard didn't check a guest list or look at a computer. He didn't return the smile either. Instead, he raised his tablet, so I could see the screen. It was a picture of me, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. In the photo, I was wearing grease-stained canvas coveralls, standing outside my mobile home with a large wrench in my hand. It wasn't a flattering picture, but what caught my attention wasn't my appearance. It was the thick, bright red line slashing right across my face, and the warning written in bold text at the bottom. Do not admit. Absolute denial. Call Napa County Sheriff if he causes a scene. I stared at the screen, my brain refusing to process what I was looking at, as if I were reading an alien language. I told him this had to be a mistake, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were gripping the steering wheel, so hard my knuckles turned white. I repeated that I am Chloe Vance's father. The guard stepped closer, and I could smell the mint gum he was chewing. He told me there was no mistake, calling me an old man. He said he had strict orders from Miss Chloe and Mr. Julian. They had explicitly commanded him not to let any blue-collar workers or hillbillies inside, especially anyone driving a piece of junk like my truck. He told me that I ruined the brand image. Brand image. That was the phrase he used. My appearance, my very presence, was treated as a public relations crisis for my daughter's perfect social gathering. The guard pointed back toward the highway and told me to turn around before I leaked oil all over his driveway. He warned me that if I wasn't gone in 30 seconds, he would radio the highway patrol, adding that a man my age wouldn't want to spend the night in a holding cell. I sat there as my truck engine let out its rough, rhythmic rumble. Looking past the guard, I gazed down the winding driveway toward the main estate. I could see the gorgeous glass canopy set up on the lawn, and the florists arranging thousands of white roses flown in from Holland. I was looking at a lifestyle that I had paid for, even though they didn't know it yet. Just then, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up and saw a text from Chloe. I opened it, holding on to a desperate hope for an explanation, an apology, or some sign that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. Instead, the message was long and incredibly cruel. She begged me not to make a scene, stating she had seen my truck pull up to the gate. She told me to just go home. She explained that Julian's partners and investors were all there, describing them as elite, high-end individuals from Silicon Valley. She wrote that if they saw me, my old truck, my rough hands, and my cheap suit, it would ruin everything. She told me that I didn't belong in this world, and that I never had. She asked me to just let her have her perfect day, promising to send me the edited photos later before telling me to leave. I read the text twice, then a third time. She didn't say she loved me, and she didn't say she was sorry. She just said I would ruin everything. She said I didn't belong. I looked back at the guard. He was tapping his watch. A smug smirk plastered across his face. He was clearly enjoying the power of keeping out someone he felt didn't belong there. He viewed himself as the gatekeeper to paradise, protecting the beautiful elite from the working class. I didn't argue with him, and I didn't yell. I didn't try to explain to him that 20 years ago, when this winery went through a bankruptcy restructuring, I was the one who cleared away all the industrial waste from the property. I didn't tell him that I know the head of the investment group that owns this entire state on a first-name basis. I simply nodded and told him I understood. I threw the truck into reverse and backed out slowly and carefully. I turned the wheel, hearing the tires crunch against the gravel. As I drove back down the cypress-lined avenue, I watched the gorgeous glass canopy fade away in my rearview mirror. The drive home was completely silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed the quiet to think and to digest the heavy reality that the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders, the girl whose scraped knees I used to bandage, and the girl I worked endless shifts for in the freezing cold salvage yard just to put her through a public relations degree at USC, had just completely erased me from her life. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. They were rough, stained with decades of motor oil, rust, and primer. Chloe was right about one thing. These hands weren't elegant. They were built for constructing things and for fixing things. But today they were discarded. My mind drifted back to a month ago. The memory felt fresh and painful, like a sharp piece of glass stuck in my boot. Chloe had brought Julian to meet me for the very first time, showing up completely unannounced. I was staying in my Airstream trailer, which was parked at the edge of a 200-acre logistics and transport hub that I own. It wasn't a mansion, but it was my camp. I had moved out there ever since my wife, Martha, passed away from cancer. It was my sanctuary. Julian had pulled onto the dirt lot in a rented Range Rover. He stepped out, wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire truck. He looked at my trailer, making absolutely no effort to hide the sneer on his face. He openly referred to my home as a shack, skipping any greeting or handshake. Chloe had laughed at his comment, a tense, sharp sound. She grabbed Julian's arm and agreed with him, mentioning how she had been trying to get me to sell the land because of how valuable it was as a logistics hub. She told Julian that even if all my old equipment was just junk, they could really use that money, suggesting they invest the funds into his Web3 blockchain project. She openly stated that selling the land would finally give me some residual value. I had just stood there holding a pitcher of fresh iced tea I had made for them, hearing every single word. Residual value. That was all I represented to them. I was just a resource, a potential ATM, wrapped in worn skin and denim. I swallowed my pride that day. I poured them their tea, and I sat through hours of Julian bragging about his tech company, his algorithms, and his future billions. I watched Chloe agree with everything he said, her devotion completely blinding her. Before they left that day, Chloe brought up the engagement dinner, telling me they were keeping it incredibly private, meant only for their inner circle. She suggested it might be too much trouble for me to travel that far, implying I shouldn't worry about making the trip. But I had insisted on going. I told her I had saved up for it, and that there was no way I would miss seeing her. She had just sighed, asking me to at least try to look presentable. Now, as I drove further away from the Oaks and Stones winery, the truth finally became clear. Looking presentable was never what she wanted. Her real goal was to make me invisible. She wanted the money my land could provide, but she didn't want the old man who had earned it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out that $100,000 cashier's check. Cold, hard cash. I stared at it for a few seconds, and then I tore it right down the middle. I tore it again, rolled down the window, and let the pieces fly out into the wind. They scattered across the California highway like confetti. I wasn't even sad anymore. The moment I saw that red line drawn across my face on that tablet, all the sadness just evaporated. What was left was something much colder and much harder. It was the clear, sober realization an experienced engineer gets when reviewing a blueprint and finding a fatal structural defect. When the foundation of a building is completely rotten, you don't paint over it. You don't patch it up. You have to bring the whole thing down. I picked up my phone again. I wasn't about to call Chloe. I wasn't going to beg them to let me inside. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the exact name I was looking for. Marcus Hall. Marcus was my personal wealth management attorney. But he was more than that. He was the executor of the Vance Family Trust, and he was my ace in the hole. You see, Chloe and Julian made a fatal miscalculation. They judged me by my truck. They judged me by my dirty work clothes. They assumed that because I lived a simple life, I was broke. They thought I lived in a mobile home because I had no choice. What they didn't know was that I stepped away from the front lines of the scrap metal business 10 years ago when I sold my heavy industrial logistics network to a Wall Street private equity firm for $70 million. They didn't know that I owned 3 fully leased commercial apartment buildings in downtown San Francisco. And they certainly didn't know that I was the majority, silent partner of the hospitality management group that held the absolute commercial debt over the Oaks and Stones winery. I hit the dial button. Marcus answered on the second ring. He asked if everything was going well, noting that the dinner should be starting right about now. I told him it wasn't starting, keeping my voice completely flat. I instructed him to pull up the file for the event at the Oaks and Stones winery, the engagement dinner for Chloe Vance and Julian Sterling. Marcus told me he had the paperwork right in front of him, reminding me that I had paid the bill in full the previous month. It was $250,000, handled entirely through an anonymous corporate sponsorship clause, exactly as I had requested. Chloe had spent the whole time believing Julian's family office paid for it. I told him to correct that, instructing him to activate Section 17, Clause G of the sponsorship agreement. There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear Marcus flipping through the pages. He repeated the clause back to me, asking if I was absolutely sure. He reminded me it was the immediate defunding and liquidation clause, which stated that if the funding party faced insult, denial of entry, or misconduct by the beneficiaries, the funds could be instantly withdrawn and all assets frozen. He called it the nuclear option. I told him I was completely sure. I explained that I was denied entry, blacklisted, and that the security guard at the gate was holding a tablet with a red line drawn right across my face. Marcus let out a quiet exclamation, his professional tone shifting into a wave of restrained anger as he asked how they could dare do such a thing. I told him to shut it down. I instructed him to call the winery general manager, contact the high-end catering suppliers, and get a hold of the security firm. I told him to let them know the linked offshore escrow account was frozen, the funding chain was broken, and that all services needed to stop immediately. Marcus reminded me the mixer was actively happening and that the Silicon Valley elite were already seated. He warned me that taking action right now would cause total chaos and bring potential legal risks. I told him I knew, staring out at the straight highway ahead of me as I told him to do it anyway. Then I added one more thing. He listened as I instructed him to contact the winery's central control room. I told him I wanted full administrative access to the closed-circuit security cameras. If I couldn't be there in person to watch my daughter's big day, I was going to watch it unfold on my rugged Panasonic laptop. Marcus assured me he would handle it right away. I hung up the phone. I was about 20 minutes away from my transport hub. In 20 minutes, I'd be able to pour myself a glass of bourbon, sit in my most worn-out but comfortable folding chair, and watch this house of cards completely collapse. They wanted a dinner without me. They were about to get exactly what they asked for, but they forgot one simple thing. A luxury dinner requires a massive amount of money to burn, and the Bank of Dad just closed its doors permanently. I pulled my truck into the bumpy dirt lot of the transport hub. The sun was starting to sink low, casting long shadows across the rusted cranes. The area was peaceful, with nothing but the distant rumble of semi-trucks out on the interstate. It was a stark contrast to the storm I had just unleashed. I walked into my Airstream trailer without even turning on the lights. I walked straight over to a hidden compartment underneath my bed and spun the combination dial. With a heavy click, the steel door popped open. There were no stacks of cash inside, just deeds, stock certificates, and the undeniable proof of a man who spent his entire life working hard and investing wisely. I pulled out a folder labeled Chloe. Inside were the irrevocable trust documents I had set up for her. This trust would have given her a substantial monthly allowance for the rest of her life, ensuring she would never have to worry about rent, medical bills, or financial hardship. I took the folder over to my small folding table. I opened a drawer and pulled out a heavy red ink stamp, the one I used to reject low-quality vendor bids. It read, "Void." I slammed the stamp down on the first page, then the second, and then the third. The heavy sound echoed loudly in the quiet trailer. It wasn't done out of anger. It was just a cleanup job. I was managing the fallout. I went to the kitchenette and poured a glass of Jack Daniels. It wasn't the thousands of dollars vintage stuff Julian drank, but the cheap kind that burns your throat on the way down. It tasted like the truth. I sat down and booted up my scratched Panasonic laptop, logging into the secure server for the Oaks and Stones winery. Marcus had worked fast. The super administrator credentials were already sitting in my inbox. I selected the camera feed for the central banquet hall. The screen flickered and then lit up. The venue looked incredibly lavish. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from heavy oak beams. The dinner tables were set with gold-rimmed bone china and crystal glasses. Waiters wearing white gloves moved through the crowd, carrying glasses of Dom Pérignon. Then I spotted Chloe. She was standing near the head table, looking absolutely radiant. She was wearing a custom-tailored dress worth a fortune, laughing with a wine glass in her hand while her other arm rested on Julian's. She looked incredibly happy and relieved. She clearly thought the problem of her father had been perfectly dealt with. I saw Julian, too. He was standing tall, chest out, talking to a group of tech executives in turtleneck sweaters, likely pitching his non-existent algorithms again. He looked like he owned the place. At the main table sat an older couple. The man was in a tuxedo, and the woman wore a glittering evening gown. They looked noble and wealthy. They had to be the elite Boston parents Chloe had told me about. I zoomed the camera in closer. Something looked off. They weren't looking at Julian with pride. They kept checking their watches and looked incredibly bored, almost like they were just punching a clock at a job. I took a sip of my whiskey, and right then, it happened. On the screen, the massive crystal chandeliers above the dance floor flickered once, twice, and then went completely dark. The smooth, upscale indoor music cut out instantly, and the speakers let out a sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback. The entire banquet hall was instantly plunged into a dim twilight, lit only by the green emergency exit signs and a few electronic candles on the tables. I watched people spin around. I watched confusion spread across the room like a wave. The smile vanished from Chloe's face. She tapped on her microphone, but there was no sound. She looked around, her face twisting into a mask of pure irritation. Then a man in a dark suit walked up onto the stage. I recognized him immediately. It was Richard, the general manager of the winery. He didn't have a microphone, so he cupped his hands around his mouth to speak. I turned up the volume on my laptop. The security microphones were incredibly sensitive, and as Richard began to speak, I could hear the murmur of the crowd fade away. He shouted for everyone's attention, apologizing for the interruption. He announced that the venue had just been notified that all funding for the event had been withdrawn, and the guaranteed line of credit established by the paying party had been fully canceled. I watched the wine glass slip right out of Chloe's hand. It shattered into pieces against the hardwood floor, spilling red wine across her white dress like a striking wound. Richard continued, his voice completely devoid of sympathy, as he explained that the establishment was a privately operated venue. He stated that without receiving the remaining balance and an operational deposit, they could not continue providing services. He announced that the kitchen was closed, the bar was shut down, and he requested all guests vacate the premises within 15 minutes. The room instantly erupted into absolute chaos. Chloe rushed toward Richard, and I could hear her screaming on the feed, her voice sharp and panicked. She demanded to know what he was talking about, shouting that her fiancé had already paid, and telling him to run his credit card again. Richard held up his tablet, turning the screen so she could see it. He explained that the paying entity was Pioneer Holdings, and the authorization came directly from Mr. Arthur Vance. He informed her that my office had reported the transaction as an unauthorized allocation of funds and issued a legal order to stop payment immediately. I stared at Chloe's face on the screen. The color drained from her skin so fast she looked like a ghost. She whispered the word, "Father." The microphone picked it up perfectly. She muttered that her father didn't have any money, calling me nothing but a junk collector. Richard took a step back, avoiding her reaching hands as he stated he wasn't aware of her father's profession. He simply told her that Pioneer Holdings held the absolute commercial debt over the winery, meaning my word was law. He reminded her she had 14 minutes left. I took another sip of my whiskey, enjoying the burn. This was only the beginning. The lights might have been out, but the real show was just getting started. Chloe was about to learn a very hard lesson. When you lock out the man who built the foundation, the entire house comes crashing down. The trailer remained silent. I opened the heavy lockbox once again and pulled out a black leather folder. It had been hand-delivered to me 3 days ago by a private courier. There was no return address on the package, just a bold red stamp that read, "Confidential." Until this exact moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Deep down, the father in me, the one who had always dreamed of holding his little girl's hand and walking her down the red carpet, wanted to believe in the fairy tale. I wanted to believe that Julian was the brilliant tech visionary Chloe said he was. I wanted to believe she had found a partner who would protect her just as fiercely as I had. But the old-school industrialist in me, the man who knew you, Never pour concrete until you've tested the load-bearing capacity of the soil. Knew better. A month ago, when Chloe started making subtle hints about needing a massive influx of cash to help Julian clear some temporary logistics expenses, I hired Reynolds. He's the top private investigator in California, a man with a heavy FBI background who specializes in uncovering the truth. I tore open the envelope. The sharp rip of the paper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet trailer. I dumped the contents onto the table, releasing a thick stack of documents that carried the faint scent of toner and cold, harsh reality. The very first page was an executive summary, the ironclad background check on Julian Sterling. My eyes scanned the basic information: social security number, last known address. It wasn't the luxury San Francisco penthouse Chloe had bragged about. His residence was a subleased apartment in a transient neighborhood right outside the Oakland airport. Next came his employment history. Chloe had claimed Julian was the CEO of a cutting-edge company called Nebula Chain, using flashy buzzwords about transforming the digital ecosystem. I looked at the actual report. Reynolds had dug deep. Current occupation, unemployed. Past employment, a shift supervisor at a car rental agency, terminated for taking client property, followed by a 3-month stint as a retail worker at a cell phone repair shop before he quit. Nebula Chain didn't exist. It was nothing more than a cheap landing page registered 3 months prior on a free hosting site filled with generic stock photos of people shaking hands in business suits. Even the CEO profile picture wasn't Julian. It was a stock image of a foreign model. As I turned to the next page, my stomach turned cold. The financial section transformed the fairy tale into a complete horror story. Julian wasn't a multimillionaire. He was drowning in debt. It was the kind of massive, crushing debt that ruins lives. The report listed judgments from 3 separate credit card companies, totaling well over $100,000. But that was just the clean debt, the kind you could eventually resolve in bankruptcy court. The following page detailed the dirty debt. Reynolds had uncovered a massive trail of gambling records, unregulated markers from Las Vegas casinos, offshore sports betting sites in the Caribbean, and underground poker rooms in Los Angeles. Julian was a compulsive gambler, and a terrible one at that. His estimated liability to unlicensed lenders sat at $4.3 million. I stared at that number. 4. Diane San Million. This wasn't just a financial crisis, it was an absolute dead end. A wave of realization washed over me, and the true purpose of this engagement dinner became glaringly obvious. This wasn't a celebration of love. It was an illegal fundraising pitch. Julian wasn't marrying my daughter because he cherished her. He was marrying her because he desperately needed the cash gifts from the wealthy guests. He needed Chloe's pristine credit score that I had spent a lifetime protecting, and he needed a wife to use as a human shield against the dangerous people who break bones to collect debts. The file was packed with photographic evidence. There were grainy photos of Julian arguing with individuals outside pool halls, images of him pawning a high-quality replica watch, and a paper trail showing that the luxury Porsche he used to show off in front of me had been rented for just an hour and rushed back to the lot to avoid an extension fee. He was an empty shell, a fraud using arrogance to mask complete desperation. And my daughter, my smart, ambitious Chloe, had swallowed the bait, hook, line, and sinker. She looked at his rented suit and borrowed car and thought she saw a prince. She looked at my fully paid-for truck and sprawling land and saw nothing but a peasant. A surge of anger hit me. For a split second, I wanted to drive right back to that winery, kick the doors open, and drag him out by his collar. I wanted to expose him right in the middle of the ballroom. But then I turned to the page titled Parents. That was the deepest cut of all. That was the moment my anger turned into cold, heavy sorrow. Chloe had spoken so proudly about Julian's parents. She told me they came from old Boston wealth, spending summers in Martha's Vineyard and winters in Aspen. She said they were elegant, cultured people who could never understand a man who smelled like motor oil. That was her excuse for keeping me at the gate. She claimed she was protecting their delicate sensibilities from the visual pollution of her working-class father. I looked down at the dossier. Reynolds had identified the couple currently sitting at the head table. The man wasn't an oil executive. His name was Gary. He was a retired high school drama teacher who made extra money doing loud commercials for used car dealerships on local cable at 2 in the morning. The woman wasn't a high society socialite either. Her name was Linda. She was a former restaurant hostess who picked up gig work through a talent agency called Distinguished Elders. Their booking fee was $300 an hour plus travel expenses. I leaned back in my chair, the silence in the trailer pressing heavily against my ears. My daughter had cast aside her real father, the man who held her hand when she needed stitches, the man who paid every cent of her expensive tuition, the man who taught her how to change a tire, just to make room for 2 paid actors selected from a casting catalog. She was ashamed of me. For the sake of a hollow illusion, she was willing to cut out the only authentic thing in her life. The anger faded, leaving behind a cold, clinical pity. If I went down there right now and stopped it with force, she would only hate me. She would claim I was jealous, accusing me of trying to destroy her happiness. She wouldn't believe a single page of this report because she was too deeply invested in the lie. I couldn't save her from herself. I could only control when to pull away the safety net. She looked down on my lack of culture, believing her career in public relations made her superior to my heavy industry work. Yet she couldn't even spot a professional con artist standing 3 feet in front of her. The final pages of the file contained text messages Reynolds had intercepted. Just yesterday, Julian had messaged a contact named Vinny, telling him not to worry about the balance. He claimed the dinner was the next night and that the old man was providing a massive dowry along with the event funding, promising to send $500,000 by Monday to get the collectors off his back. Chloe had texted Julian around the same time, confirming she had handled her father. She stated he wouldn't be able to get in because she had security blocking him, adding that she couldn't let him embarrass Julian's parents. Julian's reply was short. "Good girl. We don't need that industrial garbage around us. We're building an empire, babe." Industrial garbage. That was what he called me, and she accepted it. Good girl. He spoke to her the way someone addresses a dog trained to bite the hand that feeds it. I closed the folder and my pity hardened into absolute resolve. I was no longer an excluded father. I was a judge, and the verdict was handed down. She wanted to live in a fantasy. Fine. I would let the illusion play out until the power cut. I would let her stand in the dark with her fake husband and her fake in-laws. It wasn't cruelty. It was the only lesson she would ever understand. You cannot build a high-rise on a foundation of lies. You cannot build a life on a mountain of debt. And you certainly cannot use the people who love you as a doormat. It was time to take the house down. I stared at the laptop screen. The ballroom was now lit only by the dim green glow of the emergency lights, and the scene was turning into absolute chaos. The staff members were executing Marcus's orders, moving through the room like an army, ruthlessly clearing the food off the tables. I watched a waiter snatch a multi-$1,000 bottle of wine right out of a bridesmaid's hand before she could pour a glass. The guests were shouting in confusion, demanding to know why the food was being taken away. Chloe finally snapped out of her shock. She scrambled through the dim room, her white dress looking dull and washed out under the green safety lights. She grabbed Julian by the shoulders, shaking him violently as she screamed for him to tell the staff what was happening and to show them the wire transfer. Julian just sat there, slumped in his chair. His face was completely drained of color, sweat pouring down his forehead. He looked exactly like a cornered rat. He wouldn't even look at Chloe. His eyes were locked entirely on the exit signs. Chloe's voice began to tremble as she asked why he wasn't saying anything. Julian stood up slowly, attempting to straighten his jacket, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even level his lapels. He began to stammer an excuse about a wire transfer issue with the bank, claiming his funds were temporarily tied up in an offshore compliance review, adding that he had asked her father to cover the initial deposit. A deposit? Richard, the general manager, let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He informed Julian that Pioneer Holdings had settled the entire balance months ago, stating Julian hadn't contributed a single dime. In fact, he revealed that the credit card Julian had left at the front desk for incidental charges had been declined an hour ago for a $20 whiskey sour at the bar due to insufficient funds. It was a total devastating humiliation. 200 of Silicon Valley's elite watched in real time as this supposed tech mogul turned to ash. A man who claimed he was going to revolutionize the financial industry couldn't even cover the cost of a single drink. Richard picked up a megaphone, completely ignoring Chloe as he addressed the entire room. He announced that the kitchen was fully closed, the bar was locked down, and security was currently dismissing the valet team. He advised the guests that if they wanted their vehicles, they needed to retrieve their keys from the front desk immediately, giving them 10 minutes to vacate the private property before the main estate gates were permanently locked. Absolute panic broke out. This wasn't a fear for their safety, it was the panic of losing their dignity. The very elite Chloe had spent years trying to impress didn't linger for a second to offer comfort. They scrambled for the exits, pushing past one another. I watched women in designer gowns shoving through the doors and men in tuxedos screaming into their phones, demanding their drivers pull around immediately. Chloe stood entirely alone at the edge of the stage. Julian had already slipped away into the crowd, vanishing like a common thief. She stared out at the empty tables, the cleared food, and the darkness surrounding her. She looked exactly the way she did as a little girl, when she threw a tantrum because I wouldn't buy her candy at the grocery store. But this time, I wasn't standing behind her to clean up the mess. The show wasn't over yet. I watched the two actors, Gary and Linda, the fake parents, stand up from the main table. They weren't panicked. They just looked incredibly annoyed. Gary checked his watch, and Linda picked up her clutch. They walked right over to Chloe, who was staring blankly into space. I turned the volume up to maximum. Gary tapped Chloe on the arm, calling her sweetheart. He said he was sorry about the mess, but reminded her that their employment contract explicitly stated payment was due upon completion of the event, or at 9 in the evening, whichever came first. He pointed out it was only 8:30. But since the event was clearly over, they needed to settle up. Chloe could only stare back at him, completely frozen. "What about our appearance fee?" Linda's voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding. $300 an hour. We've been here for 5 hours, plus our travel stipend, bringing the total to $2,000. Is it cash, or are you going to Venmo us? Chloe blinked, her mind completely locking up as she struggled to understand. She asked them who they were. "I'm Gary. This is Linda," the man replied bluntly. "We're background actors. Julian hired us through an online gig network to play his parents. Look, lady, are you paying us or not? Because if you aren't, we're going to file a formal dispute on the app right now." Chloe's knees gave out, and she collapsed heavily onto the edge of the stage. Her expensive, custom-tailored dress bunched up around her like a deflated parachute. She gasped out the word, repeating that they were just actors. "We're professionals," Linda snapped, "and professionals expect to be paid for their time. Where is Julian?" "He ran away," Chloe replied, her voice sounding completely hollow. Sitting in my trailer, hundreds of miles away, I watched the consequences of her choices crash down on her all at once. She was left completely alone in the dark, wearing a dress she couldn't afford, married to a fraud, and abandoned by the father she had personally banned from the property. It was the most expensive lesson I would ever teach her. Linda opened her clutch with a rough, aggressive movement, completely dropping the elegant, high society persona she had maintained all evening. She pulled out a pack of inexpensive cigarettes and lit one right by the head table. The flame from her lighter flickered in the dim room as the smoke drifted upward. Normally, smoking was strictly forbidden in a high-end establishment like this, but all the rules had been shattered. She blew a gray cloud of smoke right toward a remaining bridesmaid who hadn't managed to leave yet. Chloe lifted her head, looking up at the woman with eyes full of tears, still desperately hoping for some shred of maternal comfort. "Mom," she sobbed, her voice barely audible. "What are we supposed to do?" Linda looked down at her, offering no smile and no embrace. She tapped the face of her watch with a manicured finger. "Don't call me Mom, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice raspy and cold. Her thick, natural accent was a stark contrast to the refined tones she had practiced earlier. The contract ended at 8 o'clock. It is now 8:05. I am officially off the clock, and frankly, the working conditions here are absolutely terrible. Chloe's mind was in complete disarray as she repeated the word contract. Gary loosened his tie and let out a long breath. He pointed at Chloe and reminded her that they were members of the Actors Guild. He explained that they had done everything required, attending rehearsals, greeting guests, and sitting through the lengthy speeches. But he emphasized that Julian had promised them cash. He stated that since they hadn't been paid, he was left wondering how he was going to cover his car payment next Tuesday. A few guests near the front of the room stopped in their tracks. This was turning out to be far more entertaining than the actual dinner. They were witnessing a slow-motion wreck. One of the women standing near the stage asked if they were really just actors. I recognized her immediately. She was Chloe's college roommate, a girl who always used her family's wealthy background to make Chloe feel inferior. Gary turned toward her and took a dramatic bow, introducing himself as Gary Henderson. He told her she might recognize him from a regional mattress commercial, joking that he was the guy who slept on the clouds. An unbelievable wave of mocking laughter broke out among the remaining crowd. A man sitting at table 4 shouted out, reminding Gary that he had just spent 20 minutes talking about offshore oil drilling futures and claiming that was how he made his fortune. Improvisation, Gary shrugged, dismissing the complaint. Method acting, I looked up the terminology on Google in the car on the way over. The wave of humiliation radiated directly through Chloe. She scrambled to her feet, her heels slipping against the polished floor as she screamed at them to shut up. She desperately told the crowd that they were Julian's parents, shouting about their supposed estate in Martha's Vineyard and their yachts. Linda took another drag from her cigarette. She told Chloe plainly that she lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens and took the subway to get around. She added that the only yacht she had ever stepped foot on was the free Staten Island ferry. She demanded to know if she was getting paid, warning Chloe that if she didn't get her money, she would call the authorities and report them for labor fraud. Chloe looked around the room frantically, screaming for Julian to make them stop. 但朱利安早就跑了。克洛伊独自站在谎言的废墟中，他用来攀附名流的2个工具，现在正当着所有见证人的面，为了$2000勒索他。Then the phones came out. At first, it was just 1 or 2 people, but as the absolute absurdity of the situation set in, the floodgates opened. The very guests Chloe had carefully selected, the friends she had banned her own father to impress, offered absolutely no help. Instead, they raised their devices and turned on their camera flashes. I watched dozens of tiny rectangular lights fill the screen, surrounding her like a swarm of fireflies around a dying animal. The flashes went off continuously, capturing Chloe's terror in high definition. I could already guess the hashtags they were typing. Hashtag scam of the century. Hashtag runaway groom. Hashtag fake in-laws. Chloe covered her face with both hands, trying to hide, but there was nowhere to run. She was trapped in the center of the dance floor, fully exposed under the harsh light of social media. I took another sip of my whiskey, realizing this was exactly what she had wanted. She wanted to be the center of attention and to go viral. Now she had gotten her wish. A girl in a pink bridesmaid dress walked right up to the edge of the stage, raising her phone to use the crying Chloe as a backdrop for a video. She spoke directly to her camera, telling her followers they wouldn't believe what was happening, calling the groom a total fraud, and explaining how the bride had been completely abandoned because the checks bounced. She called it the craziest drama she had ever seen. Chloe heard her. She dropped her hands and looked directly at her friend, begging her to stop filming. But her friend didn't stop recording. Instead, she adjusted her angle to capture the fake mother-in-law smoking her cigarette, calling the scene absolute gold. I watched Chloe's shoulders completely sag. This wasn't just fear anymore. It was the crushing weight of reality shattering her perception. She finally realized that these people were never her friends. They were just an audience, and she had become the biggest joke of the night. Linda stepped closer, invading Chloe's personal space as she delivered a low, threatening growl. She told Chloe that since Julian owed them $2,000 and was nowhere to be found, the responsibility fell on her, as his wife, to pay up. "I don't have any money," Chloe sobbed, completely breaking down. She cried that she didn't have a single dime, explaining that Julian managed all the finances. "Then give me the ring," Linda demanded. I sat straight up in my chair. "What?" Chloe gasped, instantly clutching her left hand. She repeated the word ring in disbelief. Linda reached out and grabbed Chloe by the wrist, noting that the stone looked like a 2-carat diamond. She stated that if it was real, it would cover their appearance fee, adding that she would be incredibly angry if it turned out to be cubic zirconia. "No!" Chloe screamed, trying to pull her hand away. "This is my engagement ring." "It's collateral," Gary said, stepping forward to block Chloe's path of escape. He told her to hand it over so they could leave, warning her that if she refused, they would call the police immediately, noting the amount was high enough to qualify as grand theft. The surrounding guests actually began to laugh. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a cruel, mob-like celebration. They even began to chant, shouting for her to give up the ring. This group of elites, feeling deprived of their luxury dinner, now demanded a sacrifice. Chloe looked out at the crowd. She looked at the faces she had admired, the people she had banned me to please, and found nothing but mockery. She looked down at her hand, her fingers trembling so violently that the diamond caught the dim light. "Fine!" she screamed. Take it and leave." She yanked the ring off her finger and threw it forcefully across the floor, rather than handing it over. The ring slid across the wood. Linda moved with an impressive agility for her age, diving down and snatching it up. She squinted at it under the dim emergency light. "The quality looks decent," Linda evaluated. "A pawn shop should give us a quick return on this. We're even." Gary gave Chloe one final look. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he adjusted his tie, instantly returning to the cold, detached demeanor of an actor heading to his next gig, wishing her a good evening. The two actors turned and walked down from the stage, pushing past the laughing guests and disappearing into the night through the service exit. Chloe stood frozen in place. She looked down at her bare finger. The pale mark left behind by the ring was the only authentic thing remaining on her. The guests began to disperse, fully satisfied with the drama. No one bothered to say goodbye to the bride. They walked right past her as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. Through the microphones, I could hear their whispers, calling the event an absolute disaster, and claiming they always knew she was a social climber. Chloe fell to her knees on the dirty stage floor. The floral arrangements around the room were already beginning to wither in the stuffy, unventilated air. Darkness fully set in, leaving only the eerie green glow of the exit signs. She was completely, absolutely alone. I reached for the whiskey bottle, but it was empty. That was fine. I needed to stay completely sharp for what was coming next. The demolition phase was over, and my daughter was sitting in the rubble. She buried her head in her arms, her shoulders shaking violently. I watched her cry for 1 minute, then 2, then 5. She pulled her phone out of her dress pocket, the screen illuminating her tear-stained face. She dialed a number. Right on my desk, my phone began to ring. I looked down at the flashing caller ID. Chloe. I didn't answer. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. She needed to sit in the dark a little longer. She needed to feel the true weight of the canyon she had personally carved out between us. I wasn't her safety net anymore. The ringing finally stopped. She lowered her phone, staring at the screen in complete confusion. She wasn't used to me ignoring her calls. For 28 years, I had answered every single time she reached out. But tonight, that connection was broken. She stood up unsteadily, unable to balance properly in her heels. She took one last look around the empty, dark room, realizing that nobody was coming to rescue her. Julian was gone. The fake in-laws were gone, and the guests were gone. She had to walk out on her own 2 feet. I watched her take her first step, nearly stumbling before catching herself on a chair. She kicked off the expensive custom high heels, leaving them lying on the floor like dead birds. Barefoot, she began to walk toward the exit. I closed my laptop screen, knowing exactly where she was going. There was only one place left in the entire world for her to turn. I stood up and walked to the door of my Airstream trailer. I unlocked it, but I didn't open it. Instead, I secured the heavy safety chain into place. She was coming home, but home wasn't going to be a sanctuary tonight. This time, I was the one enforcing the blacklist. My phone rang again, its sharp, desperate tone piercing the quiet cabin. I looked at the caller ID, letting it ring 4 times. On the 5th ring, I picked up. I didn't say a word. I just held the receiver to my ear and waited. "Dad!" Chloe screamed. Her voice was unrecognizable, torn and raspy from pure hysteria and absolute confusion. "Dad, what is happening? The manager said you cut the funding. He said you own the trust. Tell them it's a mistake. Tell them to turn the lights back on." I took a deep breath. Looking over at the monitor, I watched the woman pacing in the dark, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "It's not a mistake, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice as flat and calm as a weather report. "I activated Section 17, Clause G. I pulled the funding." She let out a high-pitched, frantic laugh. "What funding do you have to pull? You live in a tin shack. You drive a broken-down truck. Julian paid for this. Julian and his family office." "Julian ran away, Chloe," I countered. On the screen, I watched her whip around, staring into the darkness where her husband was supposed to be. "And as for his family, they're hourly actors. They left because their shift ended." "You're lying," she shrieked. "You're just jealous. You wanted to ruin my life because I didn't invite you." "You didn't just forget to invite me, Chloe," I corrected gently. "You blacklisted me. I saw the photo at the gate. Absolute denial. You treated me like a criminal. You treated the man who paid for your dress, your flowers, and your dinner like industrial garbage. So I took out the trash." The other end of the line went dead silent, a suffocating, heavy silence. You paid for this?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Every single cent," I said. $250,000. Julian didn't put up a dime. His credit card couldn't even cover a glass of whiskey. He's completely broke, Chloe. He's been broke since the day you met him." "No," she wailed. "No, he has millions. He has crypto. He has a company." "He has debt," I replied, shattering her final illusion. "He owes over $4 million to underground lenders. He only married you for the cash gifts. He married you because he thought I had logistics land he could borrow against." Her crying intensified into deep, gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. On the monitor, I watched her collapse into a chair. "Dad, please," she whimpered. "I'm so scared. It's dark here. Everyone left. Julian isn't answering his phone. Can you just come get me? Bring your truck. I don't care about the truck anymore. Please, just come get me." I looked at the truck keys hanging by the door. I looked at the empty bottle of whiskey. "I can't do that, Chloe," I said. "Why?" she cried out. "You're my dad." "Because I'm on the blacklist," I reminded her. "The security guard was very clear. If I show up, he calls the police. I don't want to cause a scene. I'm just respecting your wishes, Chloe. Dad, don't do this. Stop punishing me. I don't have any money on me. They even took the valet cars away. How am I supposed to get home?" "You have legs," I told her. "It's a 6-mile walk. The moon is bright tonight." "You want me to walk back in a wedding dress?" "I want you to understand what it feels like to be locked out," I said. "I want you to realize that you can't spit on the hand that feeds you and still expect it to serve you dinner. Start walking, Chloe." I hung up the phone, placing it down softly. On the screen, I watched her stare at her device in sheer disbelief, tapping wildly to call back. I reached down and pulled the phone line straight out of the wall. The lesson was over. The real test was about to begin. On the monitor, a dark figure stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains of the service entrance. It wasn't a ghost. It was the rat scurrying back onto the sinking ship to see if there was anything left to steal. Julian stepped into the dim glow of the emergency lights, his movements nervous and frantic. He had abandoned his suit jacket, and his shirt was half unbuttoned, revealing a thick chain that was clearly cheap, gold-plated brass. He didn't even glance toward his wife. His eyes were locked entirely on the table where the gift box had been placed. But the box was gone, cleared away by the winery staff along with the silverware. Julian slammed his fist down on the empty table, a dull, pathetic sound. "Julian," Chloe whispered. She scrambled up from the floor, a spark of desperate hope returning to her eyes. She thought he had come back for her. She thought her hero had returned in the dark to save her. "You came back!" she cried, running toward him barefoot across the cold hardwood floor. She reached out, grabbing his arms. "Julian, thank God. My dad, he's gone crazy. He cut the power. He said all these horrible things. We have to leave. We have to get out of here." Julian spun around. He didn't hold her, and he didn't comfort her. He ripped his arms away with a sudden violence that sent her stumbling backward. "Where's the money, Chloe?" he snarled. The deep, charming voice he used in front of investors was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, ugly screech. "The cards! The envelopes with the cash! Where did they put them?" Chloe blinked, completely lost. The gifts? I don't know. The manager cleared everything out. "Julian, what does that matter? We need to call the police. My dad—" "Shut up! Stop talking about your miserable father!" Julian screamed, spitting as he yelled under the emergency lights. "Your father is the reason I'm a dead man tonight. He locked the accounts. He froze the transfers. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Me?" Chloe cowered. "I didn't do anything. I was protecting you. I blacklisted him for you." "You didn't blacklist him well enough," Julian yelled, backing her up toward the edge of the dance floor. "Nigao su wo tashiga ruan shurzi." "You told me he was a brainless mechanic with a pension and land we could exploit. You didn't tell me he was an apex predator." He grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging deep into her skin. "Do you have cash on you?" he demanded, shaking her violently. "In your bag in the bridal suite? I need $50,000 right now to clear an expense." "50,000?" Chloe cried. "Julian, you're scaring me. Why do you need cash? We're wealthy. You have a company." Julian let out a laugh that sounded like broken glass in a grinder. "There is no company, you stupid cow," he spat. "It's a hollow web page that cost me $12 to register. I needed your credit score. I needed your father's land for collateral. Now I have nothing because you couldn't control your old man." I watched Chloe's face completely fall apart. This wasn't just heartbreak. It was the total annihilation of her entire reality. The man she had worshipped, the man she had chosen over her own flesh and blood, was staring at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. You used me," she whispered. "I tried to use you," Julian corrected viciously. "But it turns out you're completely useless. You're just a broke girl with a rich father who despises you. You're a liability." Right then I noticed movement near the back service doors on the edge of the camera frame. It was the door I had instructed Marcus to unlock remotely 3 minutes ago. 3 men walked into the banquet hall. They definitely weren't dressed for a celebration. They wore heavy leather jackets, their expressions chillingly calm. They walked with steady, heavy steps, the stride of men who are used to forcing their way in. I recognized the man in the middle immediately. Vinny, the lender from Reynolds' file. Julian saw them too and froze instantly. His grip tightened on Chloe's shoulders so hard she let out a cry of pain. "Julian!" Vinny called out. His voice was casual, almost friendly, echoing through the empty hall. "Leaving so soon? We haven't even toasted the happy couple yet." Julian spun Chloe around, forcing her body directly between himself and the men, using my daughter as a human shield. "Vinny," Julian stammered, peering over Chloe's shoulder. "Look, there's just a small misunderstanding. The wire transfer got flagged for verification, security protocols. You know how the banks are. I'll have it sent over Monday morning for sure." Vinny didn't stop walking, maintaining his steady pace. "Monday is a very long way away, Julian," Vinny said, "and my associates get very nervous over the weekend. We heard the dinner was canceled. We heard the funding dried up. That makes us think you might be planning a long vacation." "No!" Julian shrieked. "No vacation! Look, she has money!" He shoved Chloe forward, throwing her toward the men. "The money is all hers!" Julian shouted. "Her father is Arthur Vance. He owns this entire estate. Take her. Hold her for a payout. Her father will cover it. He loves her." Chloe stumbled, barely keeping her balance before she collided with Vinny. She looked back at her husband in absolute horror. "Julian!" she gasped. What are you saying? Give them your jewelry, she screamed at him. Your necklace, your Patek Philippe. Give it to them. It's fake, Julian screamed hysterically. It's a replica. I bought it at a flea market. Julian's face twisted into absolute desperation. His final assets, his final bluffs, were completely worthless. He had cornered himself. Vinny stopped 5 feet away. He glanced down at Chloe, who was shivering in her thin dress, and then looked at the fake gold chain around Julian's neck. He shook his head. We have no use for the girl, Julian, Vinny said calmly. You're the one who signed the paperwork. Julian looked left and right, realizing there was no escape. The 3 men blocked the only open exit. Pure panic overrode his senses, and the animal instinct of a trapped rat took over. He grabbed Chloe one last time. It wasn't to protect her, and it wasn't to pull her with him. He grabbed the bodice of her gown and shoved with all his force. Get away from me, he shrieked, throwing her aside. He poured all of his weight, his fear, and his failure into that violent shove. Chloe went flying backward, her feet catching in the heavy layers of tulle and silk, finding absolutely no traction on the smooth floor. She was airborne for a fraction of a second, looking like a discarded white cloud in the darkness, before crashing heavily right into the center floral display for table 4, which the cleaners had placed on the floor. It was a massive glass vase filled with water and white roses. She hit it with a sickening crash, shattering the glass completely. Water splashed everywhere, mixing with the dirt from the upturned pots. She rolled through the debris, slamming hard against the floor. Her beautiful white gown instantly soaked up the mud, dirty water, and crushed petals. She lay there, completely spread out amidst the ruins of her perfect image. White petals stuck to her wet hair, and the shoulder of her dress was torn wide open. She looked like a fallen angel that had taken a terrible, destructive drop. Julian didn't even look back. He used the brief distraction from her fall to run as fast as his legs could carry him. He leaped over chairs, knocked over a service cart, and sprinted frantically toward the double doors of the kitchen. Vinny gave a soft command to catch him. In an instant, his 2 associates moved with incredible speed. They cut Julian off, right before he could touch the kitchen doors. One of them tackled him hard, sending Julian sliding for several meters across the polished wood floor. I watched on the monitor as they grabbed him by the arms, hoisting him up effortlessly. Julian was weeping now, begging for mercy, screaming out promises that he would pay back every single cent. They ruthlessly dragged him through the back exit into the night, right toward where their vehicle was parked. Vinny took one last look down at Chloe. She was struggling to push herself up, her hands slipping against the wet, messy floor, covered in crushed petals. She was gasping for air, paralyzing shock, completely taking over. Sorry about the dress, lady, Vinny remarked, his voice deadpan, but your taste in men is absolutely terrible. He turned and walked out, leaving Chloe completely alone, right in the dead center of the security camera frame. I zoomed the lens closer. This image would stay with me for a long time, but it was a necessary part of her reality. Chloe was on her knees, surrounded by shattered glass and withered flowers. The white gown, the ultimate symbol of her vanity and delusions, was utterly destroyed. It was stained a dull gray from the muddy water and streaked with green from the crushed stems. She lifted her head, her mascara running down her face in dark streaks. She looked around the cavernous, dead-silent banquet hall. "Dad," she whispered. The microphone caught the sound perfectly. It was a faint, completely broken whimper. "Dad, it hurts so bad." Back in my trailer, my finger hovered right above the call button on my phone. Every fatherly instinct inside me was screaming, ordering me to go to her, to start up my truck, to crash through those gates, lift her up, and wipe the dirt from her face. But I pulled my hand back. If I went down there and picked her up now, she would never learn how to stand on her own 2 feet. If I cleaned up her mess, she would never understand the permanent stain left behind by her choices. Let her sit in the wreckage of those flowers. Let the freezing water numb her skin. She had built this disaster with her own hands, and now she had to face it. This was her rock bottom, and she was entirely on her own. With a mechanical, lifeless thud, The bulletproof gates of the Oaks and Stones winery locked shut, sounding exactly like a prison door closing. But Chloe wasn't locked inside. She was shut out. The exact piece of asphalt where my pickup had leaked oil earlier that evening was now the official starting line of her redemption. She stood under the dim yellow glow of the street lamp for a long time. I couldn't see her anymore. The winery's security cameras didn't extend out onto the county road, but I knew exactly what lay ahead of her. 6 miles of asphalt, loose gravel, and endless darkness. That was the very road she had traveled countless times as a little girl, riding in the back bed of my truck, always complaining about how bumpy it was. Now, she was going to feel every single inch of that road with the soles of her bare feet. She took her first step. She was wearing only one shoe. The other had been lost in the lobby during her frantic pursuit of the husband who had just discarded her. She tried to walk with a heavy limp, the remaining high heel clicking against the asphalt, sounding like a timer ticking down her misery. Click, drag, click, drag. After traveling about 100 yards, she stopped. She sat down on the metal highway guardrail, which was freezing cold in the night wind. She unbuckled the remaining shoe and threw it right into the roadside ditch. That $1,000 piece of designer Italian footwear landed in the tall weeds, discarded like worthless fast food trash. Now she was completely barefoot. The soft, shell-pink manicure she had proudly flexed on Instagram just yesterday was entirely defenseless against the rough county road. The asphalt out here was badly weathered, full of potholes and loose stone. She started walking again. This time there was no clicking sound. There was only the dull, damp sound of bare skin striking the gravel. A car approached from behind. I imagined her turning around, waving her arms frantically, the diamonds on her bracelet catching the reflection of the headlights. She probably thought it was one of her guests. Maybe it was Becky, or one of the groomsmen who had toasted to her eternal happiness just an hour earlier. The vehicle didn't slow down. The driver actually swerved slightly, veering away from the woman in the filthy white dress limping along the shoulder before hitting the gas and accelerating into the distance. They didn't see a bride. They just saw a troubled woman wandering alone in the middle of the night. They saw an issue they wanted no part of. She kept moving. The adrenaline from the ballroom was fully fading, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache of reality. Her gown, that incredibly expensive masterpiece of custom silk, now felt as heavy as a block of lead. It had soaked up the water from the broken vase, and now it was absorbing the heavy dew from the roadside weeds. It dragged behind her, catching burrs, twigs, and thick mud. It wasn't a garment anymore. It was an anchor. She was forced to bunch the fabric up in her hands, holding it tight against her chest like a bundle of dirty laundry, just to force her feet forward. Mile 2. The blisters had definitely formed by now. Soft skin rubbing against raw asphalt creates intense heat, turning into fluid, and finally exposing raw nerves. She stepped on a sharp rock, and I knew she must have screamed out in pain. She sat right in the middle of the dark road to inspect her foot. Under the pale moonlight, blood looked strangely black. She likely checked her phone again. She had a signal out here, and she could see the notifications flooding in. Tags, comments, an endless mockery. The world wasn't asleep. It was laughing. Every single step she took away from that winery was leading her further into a digital abyss. She wasn't just walking a dark road. She was moving through a digital hall of mirrors, where every reflection mocked her. She tried calling Julian again, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried Becky, voicemail. She even dialed her mother's old number, a line that had been disconnected for 10 years, just desperate to hear a voice that wouldn't judge her. She forced herself back up, limping heavily now. The chill was setting in deep. The night air in the valley drops in temperature incredibly fast, and she was wearing nothing but thin silk. In her desperation, she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. Mile 3. This was a straight stretch of road with absolutely no streetlights. The thick canopy of the surrounding oak trees completely blocked out the moonlight, leaving it pitch black. The sounds of the night, crickets, rustling brush, the hooting of an owl, sounded like monsters to a girl who had spent the last 5 years living in downtown San Francisco. She was terrified of the dark. She had been ever since she was a little girl. I used to leave a hallway light on for her every single night. Tonight, the only light was the faint glow coming from the window of my trailer, miles away, a tiny yellow needle in the dark. She started to jog, a clumsy, stumbling pace. She wanted to escape the darkness. She wanted the safety offered by the very shack she had sneered at just weeks prior. The irony of it must have tasted like ash in her mouth. The luxury resort had thrown her out. The penthouse was a total fabrication. This trailer was the only roof left in the entire world that wouldn't demand a fee to let her inside. Then she fell. It was bound to happen. Extreme exhaustion, total darkness, and uneven terrain are a dangerous combination. She went down hard, landing on her hands and knees. The gravel tore into her palms. She didn't get up right away. She just stayed there on all fours, gasping for air, dry heaving from the sheer panic taking over her system. She looked down at her hands. They were scraped, bleeding, and caked in dirt. They looked exactly like mine. Her entire adult life had been an attempt to wash the mark of a construction worker out of her DNA. She got expensive manicures. She used hundreds of dollars lotions. She even wore gloves while driving. But now, kneeling in the dirt, mixing her own blood with the earth, she had finally become the person she was trying so desperately to outrun. She was a Vance, and she was in the mud. She pushed herself up, weeping openly, letting out a low wail that only the trees could hear. She didn't bother wiping her face, letting her tears mix with the dust from the road, leaving muddy streaks down her cheeks. Mile 4. She could see the silhouette of my logistics hub now. She could see the chain-link fencing and the broken iron gate she had laughed at when riding past in that Porsche a week ago. Tonight, that gate looked like the pearly gates of heaven. She dragged her feet, one painful yard after another, leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the asphalt. With every agonizing step, another layer of her persona was stripped away. The privilege was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was pure survival. She reached the dirt turnoff leading to my lot. The gravel here was freshly laid and sharp. Walking on it must have felt like stepping on broken glass. She saw the light glowing from the trailer window, and she saw the pickup truck parked out front. The truck she had despised. The truck she had blacklisted. Tonight, there was no disgust in her eyes as she looked at it. There was only pure longing. She walked past the hood, running her hand along the rusted fender, desperate to touch something solid. She stumbled up the 3 aluminum steps of the trailer, standing right before the door. She raised her trembling, bleeding hand, the one stripped of its diamond ring. She didn't knock. She collapsed right against the door, sliding down the aluminum panel until she was nothing but a heap of ruined white silk on my welcome mat. She had traveled 6 miles through hell to get back to the start, but she hadn't crossed the finish line yet. The door was locked, and I was waiting on the other side. I heard the dull thud of her body hitting the door, followed by a muffled sob vibrating through the frame. Then came the pounding. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the frantic, terrifying banging of someone who knew the wolves were right at her heels. I stood right behind the door, my hand resting on the deadbolt. I could hear her heavy, wet breathing, sounding like a drowning person breaking the surface of the water. "Open the door!" she screamed, her voice completely raw and raspy from crying for 6 miles in the dark. "Dad, open this door right now!" I turned the deadbolt, the metal lock throwing back with a heavy mechanical click. I turned the handle, but I didn't push the door fully open. I had already engaged the thick safety chain made of hardened steel. The door opened just a mere 4 inches, just enough for me to see her, and just enough for her to look at me. The portion of her face visible through the gap was a portrait of total destruction. Her hair was matted with mud and dry leaves. Her mascara had smeared into dark bruises under her eyes, and a cut on her cheek mixed blood with the road dust. She smelled of stagnant water, cold sweat, and ruined designer perfume. She thrust her hand wildly through the opening, trying to reach the chain, trying to force her way inside. Her fingers were scraped and bleeding, her once flawless nails broken into jagged edges. "Let me in!" she gasped, clawing at the air. "It's freezing out here. I'm hurt. Let me in right now." I didn't reach for the chain. I just stood there, holding a glass of fresh water I hadn't touched, looking down at her bleeding fingers as they desperately searched for a handhold inside the very home she had mocked a week ago. "You can't come in, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of anger. Anger is hot. Right now, I was absolute zero. "What?" She stopped clawing at the air, pressing her eye right up to the gap, staring at me with a wild, unbelieving look. "What did you just say?" "I said you can't come in," I repeated. "You made it very clear that I don't fit your brand image. You put up the warnings. You hired the security. You drew the line. This threshold is that exact line. Stay on your side of it." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half shriek. "Are you insane? I just walked 6 miles. I'm bleeding. Julian abandoned me. He stole everything. You destroyed my engagement dinner, you crazy old man. And now you're going to leave me out on the porch?" "I didn't destroy your dinner, Chloe," I stated plainly. "I just stopped paying for the illusion. There was a fundamental difference." She threw her shoulder violently against the door. The chain rattled aggressively against the frame, but it held perfectly. I had personally driven those 3-inch steel screws deep into the wood myself. "You stopped paying?" she shrieked. "You think that gives you the right to humiliate me? To publicly ruin me in front of everyone I know? Julian is going to sue you. He's going to take every piece of your junk business and burn it to the ground." I took a slow sip of my water, the cold feeling grounding me. "Julian isn't going to sue anyone, Chloe," I said. "Right now, Julian is sitting in the back seat of a black Lincoln Navigator, trying to explain to a man named Vinny why he doesn't have $500,000. She completely froze. Hearing that name made her stop all of her frantic clawing. "Vinny," she stammered, her voice dropping. "Who is Vinny?" "Vinny is a loan shark and a shadow bank broker," I explained patiently, keeping my voice level, just like the times I used to teach her how to read a tape measure. "He holds the markers for Julian's gambling debts. $4.3 million, Chloe. That's the kind of debt your husband racked up. That is the exact reason he wanted to marry you. He desperately needed the cash gifts and your credit score just to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room." "You're lying," she whispered, leaning her forehead against the doorframe, her body shaking. "He's the founder of Nebula Chain. He's a tech genius." I turned around and walked back to the small table where the file was resting. I picked up the single-sheet summary of the background check, folded it in half, and slid it right through the 4-inch gap in the door. "See for yourself," I told her. She snatched the paper out of my hand. Through the gap, I watched her unfold it with trembling fingers. The porch light flickered directly over her head, illuminating the text. I could see her eyes scanning the page rapidly, taking in the employment history. Rental car clerk, cell phone repair shop worker, terminated for theft. Credit score 420. Outstanding legal judgments 6. Her fingers went limp and she dropped the paper. It drifted down onto the steps, landing right in a puddle of muddy water. "This is a fake," she stammered, though all the confidence had completely vanished from her voice. "You fabricated this. You've always hated him because he's successful, because he understands high society, and because he isn't a manual laborer like you." I looked at her, looking deep into her eyes. She was shaking like a leaf now. The last traces of adrenaline had fully evaporated, leaving nothing but the cold, unyielding reality of the night. I despise him because he's a con artist, Chloe," I told her, my voice solid. "But more than that, I despise him because he actually managed to convince you, a daughter I protected from every storm for 18 years, that your own father, the man who built the very foundation you stand on, wasn't even worthy of a seat at your dinner table." She started to cry again, but this time it was that manipulative sob she used to use whenever she wanted a new phone or needed an excuse for staying out past her curfew. "Dad, please," she whimpered. "I'm so sorry about the security guard, okay? I'm sorry. That was all Julian's idea. He said his investors were incredibly particular, and that they wouldn't understand your lifestyle. I was just trying to keep the peace. I was trying to protect you from their judgment. Protect me? I countered, pulling my face closer to the opening. You weren't protecting me, Chloe. You were protecting your illusion. You were ashamed. You looked at my truck and saw failure. You looked at my hands and saw nothing but dirt. You didn't see the decades of labor behind them. You didn't see the sacrifice. All you saw was an ugly object that didn't belong in your pristine social circle. I'm sorry, she screamed, pounding her hand against the door. I said, I'm sorry. Just open the door. I don't have anywhere else to go. They threw me out of the penthouse. I know, I replied calmly. I canceled the lease guarantee agreement. You... What? She took a step back, her eyes widening in shock. Who do you think was covering the rent on that luxury apartment every time Julian's mysterious offshore wire transfers faced a delay? I asked. Who do you think was paying your car insurance? Who do you think paid for the very dress that is dripping wet on my porch right now? She looked down at her gown, her fingers touching the torn, ruined silk. You paid for it, she whispered. Every single bit of it, I said. For 3 straight years, Chloe. Every single time you needed cash. Every financial emergency. And every time Julian faced a cash flow issue. It was me. I routed the funds through shell accounts so you wouldn't suspect a thing. I wanted you to feel independent. I wanted you to feel proud. But I was always the safety net. And tonight, I cut the cord. Why? She shrieked. If you have that kind of money, why would you do this? Why do you live out here? Why do you drive that piece of junk truck? Why do you dress like a vagrant? You lied to me. You let me believe you were broke. I didn't let you believe anything, I said, my voice hardening like iron. You made an assumption based entirely on your own superficial judgment. You looked at the cover of the book and stopped reading. You never once asked about my business. You never asked about my investments. You just kept asking for checks. I have wealth, Chloe, I continued. I have more capital than Julian could ever dream of stealing in 10 lifetimes. I hold the commercial debt over the winery you booked tonight. I own the land this transport hub sits on, and I own multiple commercial buildings in San Francisco. I am a wealthy man, but I live out here because this is the place your mother and I built from nothing. And I drive that truck because it still runs, and I don't need a Mercedes to prove my worth to anyone. She stared at me through the gap, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. The greed in her eyes began to fight against her shame. I could see the gears turning in her head as she realized the massive mistake she had made. She had thrown away a multimillionaire father for a bankrupt fraud. Dad, she started, her voice shifting, turning soft and pleading. Dad, if you have those kinds of assets, then we can fix this. We can settle Julian's debts. We can get the apartment back. You can help me. I'm your daughter. You can't just leave me out here. I'm your only child. I looked at the heavy safety chain. It was pulled taut against the frame as she leaned her weight against the door, straining the screws. I'm not helping you, Chloe, I stated. Not another dime. Never again. What? She recoiled instantly. You have to help me. It's your responsibility. My responsibility was to raise you to be a person of integrity, I said, but somewhere along the line, I failed. I gave you too much. I shielded you from too much reality. I let you believe the world owed you a luxury lifestyle, and I let you think you were superior to the people who serve food and clear trash. I am superior, she snapped, finally dropping the soft act as her anger flared. I have a degree from an elite university. I'm a director of public relations. You're a receptionist with a flashy title, Chloe, I said, ruthlessly exposing the truth. And as of tonight, you're homeless. You're also unemployed. Because I happen to know you used your agency's corporate credit card to cover the florist deposit. And when the bank processes my fraud report on that transaction, your employer is going to fire you immediately. You are nothing except what you can build with your own 2 hands. And right now, your hands are completely empty. She stared blankly at her empty palms, looking down at the scraped, bleeding skin. So this is how it ends, she whispered. You're just going to leave me out here to freeze. You're going to let me ruin myself just because I hurt your pride. I'm not letting you ruin yourself, I said, and this has nothing to do with my feelings. My feelings died the moment I saw that security directive, at the gate. This is about your character. You are rotten at the core, Chloe. You view people as disposable objects to be used. Family as a transaction, and love as a prop for your audience. I reached up to unhook the safety chain. She gasped, instantly lunging forward to force her way through the door. I slammed the sole of my heavy work boot against the base of the door, locking it completely in place. I held the wooden frame steady, staring right into her eyes from inches away. "I am not letting you inside," I told her. "If I let you in, you'll take a hot shower. You'll eat the food from my fridge, and you'll sleep in your old bed. Then tomorrow morning you'll wake up and you'll despise me all over again. You'll hate me for seeing you at your lowest. You'll hate me for having the wealth you want, and you'll start plotting how to get your hands on it. You won't learn a single thing." "Then what do you want me to do?" she screamed, spitting as she yelled into the gap. "Where am I supposed to go?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a key, a simple brass key on a plain metal ring, and tossed it through the opening. It landed on the aluminum step with a sharp, metallic clink. "That is the key to Trailer 4B at the Rust Estate Mobile Park in Barstow, right at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains," I told her. "It's a single-room unit with a hot plate and a mattress. The rent is covered for exactly 1 month. On the table inside, you'll find a bus pass and an application form for a waitress position at the Highway Diner down the road." "A trailer park in Barstow?" She gasped, horrified. "That's a slum? That's the kind of place you used to live in." "Exactly," I said. "That is the exact place where I started. That is where I learned that if you don't work, you don't eat. That is where I learned that a man's worth isn't measured by his suit, but by his word." "I am not living in a place like that," she shouted. "I am Chloe Vance." "You are nothing," I corrected, "until you prove you are worthy of that name." She looked down at the key resting in the dirt, and then looked back up at me. "I hate you," she hissed, her teeth clenched. "I hate you more than anything in this world." "I know," I said softly, "and that is exactly why you can't come in. Because you only love what I can provide for you. You don't love me." I took a step back from the door. "Dad, wait!" she cried out, sensing the final judgment descending. "Dad, please! It's dark out here. I'm scared." "You should be scared," I said. "The world is an incredibly terrifying place when you don't have a father covering your expenses." I began to pull the door shut. "Dad!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'll do whatever you want." "Pick up the key, Chloe," I said through the narrowing gap. "Pick up the key and start walking. The bus stop is right by the interstate a mile away. The last Greyhound leaves at 4 in the morning. You still have time." "But my feet," she whimpered. "Feet get tough once you build up the blisters and calluses," I told her, taking one last look at her. Under the porch light, her face was a tragic mask of pure desperation. "I'm not torturing you, Chloe. I'm providing the lesson you missed 10 years ago. I'm teaching you how to survive without a safety net. I am giving you the absolute final gift I have left to offer. I'm giving you a chance to build yourself back up from rock bottom." I slammed the door shut, turned the deadbolt, and re-engaged the safety chain from the inside. I heard her scream out in pure, helpless rage. She spent another 10 minutes pounding on the door, cursing my name, cursing Julian, and cursing the entire world. Then complete silence fell over the lot. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. I heard a faint rustling sound on the porch, followed by the slow, limping sound of footsteps fading into the distance. I walked over to the window and peered through the blinds. She was walking down the driveway, holding the hem of her ruined dress in one hand, while her other hand tightly gripped that brass key like a weapon. She was heading toward the highway, toward the Greyhound station, and toward her rock bottom. I flipped off the porch light. The course had officially begun. I parked my truck in the shadows across from that highway diner in Barstow. Taking the old back routes I knew by heart from my long-haul trucking days, I had beaten Chloe there by 20 minutes. I watched the entrance of that run-down trailer park across the street. The street lamp buzzed with a dying yellow current, flickering unstable light over cracked concrete and overflowing trash cans. This was a corner of the Rust Belt hidden from the glossy California brochures, a place where sirens were just background noise and hope was as cheap as dirt. 20 minutes later, I saw her. She stepped out from the deep shadows of the alley, a heavy limp breaking her stride. She had forced herself to walk all the way from the bus station, perhaps unable to bear the harsh, exposing glare of the public transit lights, while wearing a wedding dress that had been reduced to a filthy rag. Or perhaps she simply craved the physical agony as penance. She moved like a ghost haunting the pavement, a dust-streaked silhouette dragging the tattered remnants of her once magnificent silk train through the grime. She stopped in front of Trailer 4. It was an old vintage model from the 1980s. Security bars covered the windows, and the aluminum siding was dented and warped. She looked at the number on the door, 4B. Then she looked at the brass key in her hand. She was shaking so violently I could see it from across the street. I stepped out of my truck and slammed the door behind me. In the dead silence of the street, the sound cracked like a gunshot. Chloe gasped, spinning around with sheer terror in her eyes. But when she realized it was me, her shoulders slumped. She didn't look relieved. She just looked completely resigned to her fate. "You beat me here," she whispered, her voice as raspy as sandpaper. "I own the land under this place too, Chloe," I said, walking across the street. "I know the shortcuts." She looked up at the decaying park. In the trailer next door, a baby was crying. In the distance, a couple was shouting in a bitter argument. The air carried the heavy scent of stale beer and diesel exhaust. "This is the place?" she asked. "You want me to live here?" "This is where you are going to live," I corrected. "Follow me." I walked past her and pushed open the rusted door with a firm shove. The lock was purely decorative anyway. I held it open for her. She hesitated, staring into the dark interior of the cabin, before finally stepping inside. We stepped into the cramped space. I took the key from her trembling hand and slid it into the inner door lock. Pushing it open, I flipped the light switch. A bare bulb in the center of the ceiling flickered to life, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the room. The space was tiny, barely 150 square feet. The floor was covered in linoleum that curled up at the edges. In the corner, a single mattress sat directly on the floor, made up with clean but cheap sheets. There was a small table, a single chair, and a hot plate sitting next to a mini-fridge. The walls were painted a color that might have once been cream, but now looked more like nicotine-stained smoke. Chloe walked into the center of the trailer, turning around slowly. She looked at the window facing the brick wall next door, blocked by security bars. She looked at the bathroom door that wouldn't close completely. "It's a prison," she whispered. "It's a starting point," I said, leaning back against the closed door. "This isn't a punishment, Chloe," I told her. "This is history. You don't remember this place, do you?" She looked at me, extreme exhaustion dulling her confusion. "Why would I remember this dump?" "Because you lived here," I said, "for the first 2 years of your life. This exact trailer park, Unit 4B. This is where your mother and I brought you when you came home from the hospital. It was right here that I learned how to mix concrete by day and study logistics blueprints under this light by night. It was here that your mother used fabric scraps from the factory to sew curtains so it would feel like a home." She stared at the walls, almost as if she were trying to see the ghosts of her past. "We were happy then," I continued. "We had no money. We had no social standing. But we had each other, and we had a dream. We built our way out of this room with our own 2 hands, Chloe. We didn't do it by clinging to wealthy elites. We didn't do it by lying or scamming. We did it by building." I walked over to the small table, where a folder was resting, and opened it. "Here's the baseline," I said, my voice firm and non-negotiable. "I've paid the lot rent for the year. The utilities are in your name, prepaid for 3 months. After that, you are on your own." I pointed to the application form next to the folder. "That's an employment form for Old Sal's Diner down the highway. I know the owner. He's expecting you for the 6 a.m. shift tomorrow morning. It pays California minimum wage, plus tips. You'll wear a uniform, you'll pour coffee, and you'll wipe down tables. And you will do all of it with a smile on your face." "I can't be a waitress," she sobbed. "I have a degree in public relations from an elite university." "Your degree didn't teach you how to spot a con artist," I noted. "Maybe waiting tables will teach you how to recognize someone who is truly hungry. You need to learn the difference between a want and a need." I pulled a prepaid flip phone from my pocket and tossed it onto the mattress. "That's your phone. It only has my number, the police, and the fire department. No Instagram. No numbers for your friends. You are completely off the grid, Chloe. You are going to disappear from the world you fought so hard to impress. She looked down at the cheap plastic phone. Compared to the smartphone she had lost, it looked like a toy. And if I say no? She asked, her voice trembling. What if I just leave? Then I walk away, I replied. The door isn't locked. But if you walk out that door, Chloe, you walk out of my life forever. No inheritance, no contact, no safety net. You will be an absolute stranger to me. I paused, letting the full weight of the ultimatum rest on her shoulders, before adding one final condition in a slightly softer tone. If you stay, if you stick it out for a full year, and if you prove to me that you can survive on the money you earn with your own hands, standing on your own 2 feet, without a man or a trust fund, then we will talk. Talk about what? She asked, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. About a job, I said. A real job at my company. Not a director and not a vice president. A junior logistics dispatcher. You will learn the industry from the absolute bottom. You will learn what it actually means to build something. She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen. The arrogance that had defined her for the last 10 years was completely gone. She looked at the mattress on the floor, the hot plate, and her ruined dress. She was wearing a costume meant for a canceled play of vanity. She finally realized she had no cards left to play. Julian had stolen her future, and I had pulled away her safety net. She was completely stripped bare. I watched the last spark of resistance die in her eyes. Her shoulders slumped, and she lowered her head. Okay, she said softly. Louder, I demanded, wanting to hear it clearly. Okay, she raised her voice. I'll stay, I'll do it. Good, I said, walking toward the exit and placing my hand on the knob. There are clothes in the closet, I noted. I went to Target. Jeans, t-shirts, and work shoes. Take that dress off, Chloe. Burn it. It doesn't suit you anymore. I pulled the door open. Dad, she called out behind me. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. Did you actually blacklist yourself? She asked. That photo at the gate, did you put it there? I looked out into the dim walkway. No, Chloe, I said. You put that photo up. I just enforced it. I stepped out and closed the door, hearing the latch click into place behind me. I stood in the oil-scented air of the park for a moment, just listening. I heard her footsteps cross the linoleum floor, followed by the rustle of the silk gown. Then I heard the sound of the shower turning on. She was washing away the mud. She was washing away the makeup. She was washing away the lies. I walked down the rusted iron steps, my boots heavy against the metal. I got into my truck and started the engine, but I didn't drive home immediately. I sat there for a long time, watching the window of Unit 4B. The lights stayed on. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, leaving my only child in a place like this to wash dishes and count coins. Every fatherly instinct inside me was screaming to run back inside, wrap her in a blanket, and take her back to my comfortable trailer, to tell her it was all just a bad dream. But a parent's job isn't just to shield a child from the world. It's to prepare them for it. Chloe wasn't prepared. She was too fragile and too entitled. If I rescued her now, she would stay weak forever. If I let her stay broken, she might just have a chance to rebuild herself into something stronger. I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time all day, I felt a small flicker of hope. She hadn't run. She hadn't given up. She stayed. The demolition was finished. The foundation had been repoured. Now the real construction began. I sat in my truck parked a few blocks away from Old Sal's diner, watching the seasons shift. Summer turned into autumn, stripping the leaves from the few trees along the highway, leaving the trailer park looking even more exposed and ugly under the gray sky. Then winter arrived, frosting the windows of 4B with ice patterns that looked like prison bars. I never went inside and I never called, but I kept watching her. I watched her leave her trailer every morning at 5:30. In the beginning, she always walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched against the freezing wind, wearing the cheap jacket I had left in the closet. She looked miserable, like an inmate serving a sentence. But as the months went by, her posture changed. Her stride grew wider. She stopped staring at her toes and started looking straight ahead at the horizon. Sometimes I would go into Sal's diner, always sitting in the dimmest corner booth with my baseball cap pulled down low. I watched her work. It was grueling labor. The morning rush at Sal's was a war zone of clattering plates and shouted orders. Some of the long-haul drivers and travelers thought a $3 tip gave them the right to treat the staff like servants. I watched a salesman in a cheap suit snap his fingers at her because his toast was cold. "Excuse me, sweetheart," the man barked. "I have a video meeting in 10 minutes. This stuff is garbage. Take it back and redo it." The old Chloe would have thrown the plate in his face. The old Chloe would have screamed that her shoes cost more than his car. But the Chloe standing there didn't even blink. She picked up the plate. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said, her voice steady and professional. "I'll bring you a fresh order right out of the kitchen." She walked back to the kitchen, navigating smoothly past a busboy carrying a mountain of dirty dishes. She didn't cry, and she didn't complain. She just solved the problem. I watched her count her tips at the end of her shift. She sat at the counter, still in her uniform stained with coffee and ketchup, separating crumpled $1 bills and coins into neat stacks. I could see her lips moving, doing the math. Rent, electricity, groceries, living expenses. On a Tuesday in March, I followed her to the local discount grocery store in town. She wasn't shopping at Whole Foods anymore. This discount place had fluorescent lights that buzzed with a dying hum, and the produce on the shelves always looked a little bruised around the edges. She was carrying a handbasket instead of pushing a cart. She picked up a package of ground beef, glanced at the price tag, and placed it right back on the shelf. Instead, she reached for a box of the store-brand pasta. Standing in the checkout line, she counted out the exact change from a tiny plastic coin purse. She was short by 10 cents. The cashier, a tired-looking high school kid, rolled his eyes. I saw Chloe's face flush red, not with anger, but with pure, authentic shame. She didn't demand to see a manager, and she didn't reach for a black credit card that no longer belonged to her. "Just take the apple off," Chloe said calmly. "I don't need the apple." Right at that exact moment, I knew the entitled arrogance had been completely burned out of her system, replaced by the cold, hard, mathematical reality of life. She had finally learned the most important lesson in economics. You cannot squander what you haven't personally earned. Spring arrived, the winter ice melted, and Chloe was still there. She didn't run back to her old crowd, and she didn't look for a wealthy new boyfriend to rescue her. She was working back-to-back shifts. She was exhausted, and she had lost weight. Her hands were rough and chapped from the bleach and dishwater, but her eyes were clear. The frantic, desperate look from that night on my porch was completely gone. In its place was the steady gaze of a woman who knew she could survive in the dark. Exactly 1 year to the day after that disastrous engagement dinner, I walked into Old Sal's diner at 10 in the morning. The morning rush was already over, and the air smelled of bacon grease and sanitizer. I didn't sit in the corner booth this time. I took a seat right by the window. The bell above the door chimed. Chloe was behind the counter wiping down the pastry display, and when she looked up, she froze. The rag in her hand stopped moving entirely. She looked at me, and I looked right back at her. She didn't run over to me, and she didn't scream out for her dad. She just set her rag down, picked up a coffee pot along with a mug, walked around the counter, and stepped up to my table. She poured the coffee. Black, no sugar, exactly how I take it. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice incredibly steady. "Hi, Chloe," I replied. She set the pot down and pulled an order pad from her apron pocket, asking what I wanted, and noting that the daily special was meatloaf, adding that Sal had made it fresh that morning and it was actually pretty decent. I looked at her. She was wearing a name tag that simply read Chloe. No titles, no packaging, just her name. "I'm not hungry," I said. "I'm here to talk business." "Business?" she asked, remaining on her feet. She stood there holding a respectful posture, showing deference to a customer and to her father. I reached into my jacket pocket. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the laminated tabletop. "Open it," I instructed. Before touching it, she wiped her hands on her apron. She opened the folder to find a single sheet of paper, an employment contract. "Pioneer Heavy Industrial Logistics," she read aloud. "Position, Junior Dispatch Analyst." It's entry level, I noted. You'll report directly to the fleet manager. You'll track vehicle mileage, handle driver complaints, and work the holidays. The starting salary is $55,000 a year. It's enough to lease a decent apartment near the transport hub. It's not a San Francisco penthouse, but it has working heat. She looked up at me, her eyes widening as she asked if I wanted her to do the dirty work at the very bottom of my company. I want you to learn how to manage it, I told her. I let the general manager of our LA branch go last week because he liked exploiting the people under him. I need someone who understands how the ground floor operates, someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be locked out, so they never bar the door against someone of true value again. She looked down at the contract, her thumb tracing the corporate logo. And if I say no, she asked. Then you stay right here, I said. You're an excellent waitress, Chloe. Sal appreciates your work, and you can make an honest, clean living doing this for the rest of your life. She closed the folder and held it tight against her chest. Why, she asked. Why now? Because you stayed, I told her. Because you paid for your pasta with exact change. And because in these 12 months, you never once called to beg me for a handout. You served your time, Chloe. You built your foundation. Now I'm offering the bricks to build the house. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She took a deep breath and gave a firm nod, accepting the offer. But, she continued, I have one condition. I raised an eyebrow, noting that she was trying to negotiate with me. I want to pay you back, she stated, for the dinner, for the dress, and for the lease penalty you covered on the apartment. I know it will take me years, but I want a payment plan deducted directly from my salary. I looked at her, seeing the sheer grit in the line of her jaw. I could see the builder gene of the Vance family flowing through her veins. Deal, I said. She reached out and shook my hand. Her palm was rough, covered in firm calluses. It felt exactly like mine. Table 4 needs coffee, she said, pulling her hand back. I'm off the clock at 2. I'll have the truck parked out front, I told her. She turned and walked back toward the counter, her movements direct, filled with strength and purpose. I watched her walk away and took a sip of the coffee she had poured. It was hot and bitter, the best cup of coffee I had ever tasted. The access denied sign at the gate was completely gone. The blacklist was lifted and my daughter was coming home. She wasn't returning as a manufactured high society princess, but as a true partner, and that was worth more than all the gold in the world. In a world obsessed with filters and artificial personas, we often mistake flashy packaging for the actual gift. Chloe chased after a golden illusion and nearly lost the only priceless thing she had, the unyielding bond of family and a foundation of integrity. This story is a powerful reminder that true value is never found in a superficial bank account or a designer label. It lives in the calluses earned from hard labor and in the dignity of keeping your word. Sometimes, the greatest love a father can show a child isn't serving the world to them on a silver platter, but having the strength to step back and let them build their own world with their own 2 hands, even if it means letting them hit rock bottom first.